Balancing and Sustainable Democracy โดยผู้ทรงคุณวุฒิและประสบการณ์จากต่างประเทศได้ร่วมกันอภิปรายบนเวทีนี้โดยได้รับเกียรตินะครับจากดร.ชิงชัยหานเจนลักษณ์ประธานกรรมการจัดงานประชุมวิชาการสถาบันพระปกเกล้าครั้งที่ 16 จะให้เกียรติเป็นผู้ดำเนินการอภิปรายในเวทีนี้ครับคุณอนุมาครับ
ค่ะโอกาสนี้ก็ขอแนะนำประวัติท่านผู้ดำเนินรายการอภิปรายพอสังเขปนะคะสำหรับประวัติการศึกษาของท่านอาจารย์นะคะท่านอาจารย์สำเร็จปริญญาเอกด้านกฎหมายมหาชนจากมหาวิทยาลัยกองประเทศฝรั่งเศสนะคะประกาศนียบัตรด้าน Management จากมหาวิทยาลัย Western Ontario ประเทศแคนาดาประกาศนียบัตรด้าน Project Analysis มหาวิทยาลัย Connecticut ประเทศสหรัฐอเมริกานะคะประวัติการทำงานที่สำคัญของท่านในอดีตนะคะท่านเคยดำรงตำแหน่งที่ปรึกษารัฐมนตรีต่างประเทศกรรมการบริหารสำนักงานกองทุนสนับสนุนการสร้างเสริมสุขภาพประธานกรรมการบริหารสำนักงานรับรองมาตรฐานและประเมินคุณภาพการศึกษาองค์การมหาชนนะคะสำหรับประวัติตำแหน่งปัจจุบันนะคะท่านดำรงตำแหน่งกรรมการสภาสถาบันพระปกเกล้าและสมาชิกสภาปฏิรูปแห่งชาติด้านการศึกษาค่ะ
ครับลำดับต่อไปขอเสียงปรบมือครับต้อนรับดร.ชิงชัยหานเจนลักษณ์ครับครับแล้วเราสองคนขออนุญาตส่งมอบเวทีให้กับท่านผู้ดำเนินการอภิปรายเลยครับ
Well, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I think you already have heard from our keynote speaker, Dr. Sulin Pitsuwan, about his excellent review, excellent presentation of the state-of-the-art review of democratic evolution in Thailand. Now, the next 2 hours, I think we are going to hear from our foreign friends, how they look at this democratic evolution in our country. Dr. Sulin has pointed out that our political evolution has been going up and down and has passed, has evaluating through this process of growing pain ก็เหมือนเด็กที่ฟันน้ำนมกำลังขึ้นนะ and the political change has really become the nature of Thai political development for the past over 80 years. The dynamic of Thai political powers reflects the problem of political momentum and the way to design political institutions that are relevant to democratic principle and appropriate to the Thai social context. คือเราต้องการสถาบันทางด้านประชาธิปไตยแต่ในขณะเดียวกันเราก็ยังต้องอยากจะเก็บไว้ซึ่งวัฒนธรรมประเพณีของไทย So in my view over the past 80 years we may have been using too much C&D technologies. C&D, I would expand stand for copy and duplicate. So we try to copy democratic institutions and duplicate them in Thailand. Well, whether those work or not, I will leave this to your own judgment. We may have in the past focused on the destination of full-fledged democracy. Should we not at present pay equal attention to the journey and move forward with more balance to achieve sustainable goals. Hopefully, this 16th annual KPI Congress might be able to provide some answer. In this connection, we have the privilege of having three well-known panelists to join us this afternoon. Immediately on my left is Professor Masahiro Ori, who is the Director Executive Development Center for Global Leadership, the National Graduate Institute for Policy Study. And then we have Professor Andrew Ellis, who is the former Director Asia and the Pacific International IDEA, and currently an expert on elections, constitutions, and democracy building. Perhaps he may be able to give us some tips on how to construct our own democracy. And in this connection, I would like to take this opportunity to express our sincere thanks and appreciation to Ambassador Mark Kent, who were kind enough to support the participation of Mr. Ellis, and hope he will continue to support KPI for years to come. And our last presenter is Professor Alain Hicken. He is the Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, University of Michigan. Please welcome our three distinguished panelists. Well, without any delay and to keep on moving and perhaps to leave some more room, some more time for questions and answers at the end of the session, may I ask our panelists to keep the presentation about 20 minutes? 30 minutes? Okay, 30 minutes, okay. I mean, yeah, easy to bargain with anyway. So, well, shall we start with you, Professor Ori, please?
Okay. Well, I was told to make a presentation within 20 minutes, but today, a couple of hours ago, we were told that how about 30 minutes, and we said okay. So I'm now wondering, but anyhow, I try to speak as succinct as possible. Well, it is a great honor to be invited to participate in this important forum or Congress. Even though I'm not an expert on Thai affairs, but I have a long relationship with institutions in Thailand, and I have many friends. I have many friends here in Thailand. So I felt that I should do something. Not necessarily talking about Thai cases or Thai government or Thai politics, but with reference to Japanese cases, I hope that it will give something, some hint, some issues to consider for you. Then I would be very happy, and I think I can fulfill my responsibility of appearing here in this important forum. So I set up my title as Systems, Organization, and People for Sustainable Democracy, thinking of democracy with reference to the case of Japan. Well, the subject I would like to cover is very wide. As Dr. Selin covered many issues to be discussed, I will also refer to many issues. Well, as I said, with reference to the cases in Japan. After introduction, I will talk about systems of separation of powers and democracy in Japan and reality systems on the paper is different from reality. Reality is different. So it is important to know the reality. Without understanding the reality, we cannot get the benefit. So I will talk about seriously and sincerely about the reality, good or bad, merits and demerits. After that, I will talk about the conditions for appropriate to sustainable democracy, and then with some concluding remarks. The first is introduction. Power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolute. This is what Dr. Sulin said, the word of Lord Acton in UK. Well, therefore, the democracy to function appropriately, it is necessary to protect, to prevent the corruption of power and to ensure the appropriate functioning of systems, organization, and people responsible for the appropriate, sustainable democracy. That's why I would like to point out first this one. Well, next is the systems of separation of power and democracy. Well, I include that. Thanks to the staff for help, my full paper is included in this voluminous book. So, for your interest, for the details of my essay presentation, please look at the page from 57 and some pages after that. But I use PowerPoint because of the limited time. Well, systems of the separation of power and democracy, and check and balance of power, prevention of the abuse of power and corruption, democracy, and equal rights and opportunities for everyone. Of course, other, objectives or other aims embedded in the system of separation of power you can think of, but I would like to emphasize these 3 points. Well, as to the separation of power, we can think of 2 dimensions. One is the vertical separation of power between the different levels of government, and the horizontal separation of power within the same level of government. I will go more in detail next. The separation of power between the national and local government can be discussed in the following way, although somewhat different between unitary system country and federal system country. Well, in Japan, as a unitary system country, we are told that Japan is a very much centralized country. But as you see here, with population 127 million, the local government full-time employee is much, much more than that of the national government, as you see it in the bottom of this page. That means that the workload or the responsibility of local government by far larger than the central government. So the role of the central government it covers almost all areas except defense, national defense, and diplomacies. In all other areas, local government play a very, very important role. Then how about the local government functions? Is the next point I'd like to emphasize. Japan is with 2 tiers of local government, maybe similar to Thailand. For the, Thai provinces, we have the prefectures, 47 prefectures. And below prefecture, we have about 1,700 municipalities called the city, town, or villages. Each local government has a chief executive and local assembly. Chief executive of the prefecture government is governor. He is elected directly by the people for 4-year term. And also members of prefectural assemblies are also directly elected by people for 4-year terms. How about the case of municipalities? Chief of municipalities is called mayor, and he or she is elected directly by the people for 4-year term. So is the case with members of local assembly at the municipality level, are elected for 4-year term by people's direct board. This is the case in Japan. Well, the local government is a government closest to the people, so it is possible and actually adopted the direct democratic systems. That means people directly participate in some aspect of the operation of the government, even to remove the chief executive, even to remove the members of local assembly. This is direct democratic system, how it functions. And nowadays, with the other results of the decentralization in Japan, more work are given to local government. People are interested in what's going on in local areas. So there occurred a very severe competition among local government. That means among prefecture or among, say, municipal chief executives, governors and mayors, because they are elected by the people. If their achievement is not satisfactory, they may be replaced in the next election by the people. That's what's happening in Japan. And also, the difference among prefectures, difference among municipalities is because of not only, well, not necessarily because of the, say, help of the central government, but because of the efforts, lack of efforts or sufficient efforts by local government itself or the local people living there. People now coming to understand that kind of things. This is the separation of power between the different levels. Next is the separation of power at the same level of government, at the national government level. As in many countries, Japan is divided the legislative power, executive power, and judicial power. Legislative power, which is parliament or diet in Japan, it is composed of two houses. House of Representatives, House of Councillors. As you see, 480 members for the House of Representatives for 4-year term, and the other one for 6-year term. The election system, I would explain a little bit, but becoming similar. And the executive power, of course, is in the cabinet. Prime Minister is chosen from among the members of parliament, and the majority of the ministers of state are to be chosen from among the members of parliament. That's why we call it parliamentary cabinet system. Judicial system is quite different from tied cases. We have a straight, direct, one-way, say, court systems. Supreme Court, which reviews also the constitutionality of laws. So we do not have constitutional court in Japan. We do not have an administrative court in Japan. All the cases involving the application of laws is to be dealt with by these courts. Well, next is the relationship between the Diet and cabinet. I don't go into too much, but as I said, since we have the parliamentary cabinet system, cabinet need to have this stable basis in the parliament. Prime Minister is chosen, and the majority of ministers are chosen from among the members. Well, each house has a right to choose. Judicially in Japan, I would like to repeat again the difference between that of Japan and that of Thailand. But I'd like to point out, first point on top. The Constitution requires that all judges shall be independent in the exercise of their conscience and shall be found only by the Constitution and the laws. The Constitution stipulates that judges shall not be removed except by public impeachment unless declared mentally or physically incompetent to perform official duties, and that no disciplinary action against judges shall be administered by any executive organ or agency. I'd like to especially point out the importance of the bottom two. Most judges are recruited from among those who passed the national bar examination. There are also judges, very few, appointed from among experienced law professors. This national bar examination is one of the most difficult examinations in Japan. The bottom, judges are assumed are the highest, brightest people and highly professional and regarded as people of cleanness and integrity. They are among the most respected in the Japanese society. Much more than respected than politicians, of course, much more respected than bureaucrats in the executive branch. That is quite important. People have trust in the judicial system and practice of courts. Next is the safeguard against the corruption. Corruption is a, say, popular subject or a prevalent subject in most of the Asian countries. But I'm happy that Japan is not that much corrupted. Because of these organizations, I think they are sincerely working, not only the court, but the public prosecutor's office, and these offices are free from, we exempted from any kind of, say, corruptions or violation. They are peoples of integrity, highly respected peoples. Well, next, come back to the election. Well, this is the results of recent elections. For the House of Representatives, we have single-seat constituency systems. That is, 300 out of 400 members are elected from this single-seat constituency. That means we choose only one successful, say, winner from each constituency. So if you get 51, you get seat. But if you get only 49, you cannot get seat. This is a system. Well, this is LDP is ruling party at present, and Democratic Party of Japan is was a ruling party for 3 years until 2012. Well, if you look at the, say, 3 elections, 2005 and 2009, I'm sorry, it's not 2010, but 2010 and 2012, it shows a ratio of votes, number of votes each party get, and the number of seats each party get. You would see quite a difference between the ratio of votes they get and the number of seats actually they get. Quite a contrast. With fewer than 50%, the LDP get more than 200 seats, almost 70 or 80% of all the seats. This is what happens by the single-seat constituency system. Well, the other case, the other house, you look at the second part of the results of election for the House of Councillors. Again, they shows the ratio of votes each party get and the number of seats each party gets. Well, a little bit moderate result, more moderate than the case of the other house. But yet, since there are single-seat constituencies, so the result does not necessarily, say, collectively reflect the percentage of votes each party get. The larger party get more seats. Okay. This is what happened. I may come back the merit and demerit of this kind of election systems. Well, the reality, then, because of the time limit, I would like to go on to the reality of this system in Japan. First, as we have seen, we have so frequent elections. Well, sorry, let me cut. 2005, 2007, 2007, 2010, 2012, 2013. This is the election for the members of parliament. So almost every 2 years or so, we do have elections. How can we think of this situation? Is it good or is it problematic? That's what I would like to talk about as merits or demerits of frequent elections. Well, various arguments are, say, about viewpoints and interests or concerns can be discussed. While democracy and opportunities for people, frequent elections is good for the democratic viewpoint, but it is understood the parliament can be responsive to the people. But it leads to the instability, maybe, or stability, depending on the situation. Well, if the ruling party gets the landslide victory, it leads to the very stable government. But if the opposition party, say, get the winning, then the ruling party changes, so the government changes. If it happens so frequently, this kind of changes, it leads to the instability of politics. Even though it reflects the result of elections, it is good for the, say, continuous, say, operation of the government. That's one point. And politicians may become with short-sighted perspectives. If they have to face the election so frequently, They have no, say, feeling to think with long-term perspective. They think of the next election. So they come with a short-term framework constellations. And if they say a situation completely changes, new, fresh members of parliament comes. They have no experience. They are not experienced in politics. With few experiences, they have to run the government. They have to, say, do a lot of works in the parliament. Is it good or not? That's what we need to consider. And the quality of politicians, quality of policies you can think of. If we have so fresh but unexperienced politicians, then what will be the discussion look like that? Bureaucrats may lead the discussion, that sort of things. Next is the bicameral system, two houses system. Is it good or not? Whether it is functioning well or not. Original objective is quite understandable, because we may make a mistake if we have only one house. So we have another house to check, to have more, say, serious, more continuous, more careful constellation of the issues without worrying about the dissolution, without worrying about the election, things like that. But if the composition of the houses becomes similar, if they are elected by the similar election systems, if they are, say, organized according to the same political party or groups, then what the difference? What the difference? People become to wonder, is it necessary or not? Like that. That's the new issues in Japan. And the reality, as I said, the election systems, as say through the series of changes, the election system for the House of Representatives and House of Councillors becomes similar. So it is difficult. The election reflects different opinions. And the change of actual functioning of the House, well, the functioning of both houses becomes similar. That's what I would like to emphasize. So the controversies. The last point here is the irony of that twisted diet, the divided government. As happened in USA yesterday, the President Obama have to work together with the opposition party-ruled Congress. In Japan, since we have a parliamentary cabinet system, so the Prime Minister usually or always have a majority in the House of Representatives. On the other hand, if the ruling party or the Prime Minister's party has minority in the other house, this is what we call twisted. Supported strongly by one house, but it is not supported well enough by the other house. This is what we call the twisted diet. Then what will happen? Important bills will not be passed by another house. Important discussions may stop like that. People come to think that the government cannot decide on important things. That's what they say, that could not make any serious decisions, they say. Well, in the last two elections, Prime Minister Abe got a majority in both houses. That's how he solved this problem. But then, the time comes, people said that Prime Minister Abe goes too fast without much discussions because he controls two houses. So he can go ahead with whatever he thinks of necessary to do. Then people began to criticize. If the ruling party is too strong, it is not also good. This is democracy, you know. There is a minority, different opinions. But if the majority does not want to hear seriously the minority's opinion, it is not good. That's what people are concerned, even though the ruling party, Liberal Democratic, is seemingly paying attention to the minority opinions. But yet, in many people's eyes, it looks like that the majority is making abuse of majority powers. That's what we need to discuss. Well, parliamentary, the last point I need to look about the reality is the parliamentary cabinet and functioning of the diet. we have at least the separation of power. But yet, under the parliamentary cabinet system, there is a very close relationship between the parliament and the cabinet. And it is inevitable. But as a member of the Diet, they have to work as a member of independent Diet. How it is possible? For opposition party members, it is quite clear. They should act as the members of parliament, other opposition party members. For the members of ruling parties, it is not that clear, because they have to support the bills and budget submitted by the cabinet. So to get the action as early as possible, they may limit the time of their own discussions. Instead, they try to examine the budget and bill before they are submitted to the parliament. In that case, discussions within the ruling party may not be, say, made open to the public. It may be the deal behind the door and similar thing like that. Transparency may not be enough. That's the point in this kind of situation. Okay, then what we should do? Well, sorry. Oh, sorry. What we should do? I would like to present 3 conditions necessary for appropriate sustainable democracy, because having systems is not just enough. People in the government need to play an important role. The full understanding of the importance of democracy by the people in the government is crucially important. Understanding the value of wisdom, energy, and potentiality of the general public and peaceful use of them is crucial for the democratic development of society. If they do not want to involve people, if they do not want to go forward for the democratization, then they have many tools to stop that. So we need to have their understanding, especially political leaders. The second is the general public. Democracy is fostered and supported by the people. So the existence of well-informed, active citizens is a prerequisite for the sustainable democracy. Education and practice is important. Experiencing the democratic process to address issues constructively and to solve problems in peaceful manner is extremely meaningful. Well, having discussions with people with different opinion and how to solve the problem, how to come to conclusion, how to have a compromise, how to implement the decision they have made. This kind of thing is a process of democracy. So to educate and let them practice, this is important basis or conditions for the sustainable democracy. The third one is mass media. It is not easy for the general public to get necessary data and information continuously. Mass media has important roles as a mirror, arena, and actor in the society. The high-quality, pro-democracy information mass media continues to be important infrastructure for appropriate, sustainable democracy. Public opinion conducted by mass media should not be avoided, should not be criticized too much, should not be neglected, because it reflects the opinion of the people. And a responsive government, responsive leader would probably respond well enough. In the concluding remarks, to construct an appropriate sustainable democracy is not an easy task, a long way to go. America is a champion of the democratic world, but yet it is not without problems. It was used to call the melting pot, but the American society is not melted at all, right? So it is not without serious problems. Every democratic society is making strenuous efforts, not only Thailand, but other countries as well. So we have to look at ourselves. What are the problems facing us? And we have to think ourselves how to solve it. In doing so, experiences in other countries will be of some use, helpful for you to understand. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. Very informative, and I think a lot of points presented by Professor Ori could clearly be applied to Thailand. I just would like to make very short, three short comments. Well, when you talk about frequent elections in Japan, I think we also have very frequent coups in Thailand. Which is better? Well, perhaps that could be the next research work of KPI to find out whether frequent elections better than frequent coups or vice versa. So I think it's I leave this to KPI to consider. The second point I would like to make is you're talking about very hard problem of the Thai constitution, whether to have strong cabinet and weak parliament, or strong parliament and weak cabinet. I think we have experienced both. So our next constitution, I don't know whether what will come out. Dr. Bawon Sak, the Secretary General of KPI, is also chairman of the Constitution Drafting Committee, and I'm quite sure he is well aware of this. The third point I would like to make is, you see, Japan, as Thailand, has a unitary system of government, one and indivisible. Indivisible. But still, Japan has really done a lot on this decentralization. This is very related to what Dr. Sulin is very related to Dr. Sulin's expose on decentralization. Japan, you have elected governors, elected mayor, and elected assembly. This, I don't think I have time to comment on that, but shall we, I just leave this to the audience to consider and to our Constitution Drafting Committee to look into. But let me get to our second panelist, Dr. Andrew Ellis from UK. Please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jingjai. May I start by expressing my thanks to KPI for the opportunity to share some thoughts this afternoon, and to add my thanks to those of Dr. Jingjai, to Ambassador Kent in the UK for enabling me to do so. We have all been asked this afternoon to think about power dynamics and sustainable democracy. And in thinking how to do this, I started with what do we mean by sustainable democracy? There's no universal blueprint of a democracy. There's no set of instructions that you can just pull bits out of a box and knock them together, and wherever you are, you press the button and it will work. There are principles and values that characterize all democracies, wherever in the world they may be. And just because there is no blueprint, that does not mean that it's possible to be democratic just by saying that you are. I doubt if any of us take North Korea as democratic, even though it calls itself the Democratic People's Republic. The frameworks and the institutions and the processes of democracy are only going to be sustainable if they're developed within a country. They're not imposed and imported from outside. The process of doing that is hugely enriched by comparison. Not prescriptive comparison, but comparison as a source of ideas, as a way of informing and enriching debate, and as a way of setting contexts and challenges. As I've noted very much this year on visiting Myanmar during the course of the year and hearing the number of my friends and contacts there who are talking with some pride about their perception that they're overtaking Thailand. Credible and legitimate frameworks are going to vary with political culture. They're also going to change over time. And to illustrate this, I give an example from Indonesia. Indonesia, when it became independent in 1945, adopted a very short constitution, set up some major state institutions, one of which was called the Supreme Advisory Council, the DPA. And the function of the DPA was to be a forum in which respected elders of society could give input to the political process. By 2000 or 2001, even before Indonesia's constitutional amendment process, the DPA was no longer really regarded as a source of important input. It was a body that you gave half an hour to show respect to the people who were on it, but that was about all. What you actually were concentrating on was what the legislature and the executive and the judiciary were doing. And under the constitutional amendments, the Indonesians abolished it. Values in Indonesian society had changed over time. Indonesia's institutions changed over time to reflect that. And in looking at comparisons, I think it's interesting to look at countries in particular whose values are quite similar to those of Thailand. Fortunately, there is a global research project called the World Values Survey, which looks at the general values of society and how they change from one year to the next. And in looking at the values of Thailand, countries that have similar clusters of values include India, include Malaysia, include Indonesia, include Chile, and include Argentina. The two basic principles which all democracies share are perhaps defined as popular control, the recognition of the rights of citizens to control the process of decision-making and to control the decision-makers who act on their behalf, and also political equality, the recognition that all citizens are considered as equal in the input they have in exercising that control. How do we assess that? Assessment is, like democracy building itself, something that lies with citizens. And I'd like to recall here some work that was done by International IDEA, the body I used to work for, in putting together a global framework to support citizens in making this kind of assessment. There's a guidebook to this, which KPI, in partnership with IDEA, has translated into Thai and which is available electronically. So there is a lot of experience already here in Thailand with the ability to ask questions, to support citizens in assessing democracy and assessing democratic reform, in looking at the principles of popular control and of political equality, the framework picks up 7 values, mediating values, through which those principles are expressed. The first of those is participation, the way in which a country defines civil and political rights, the way in which those civil and political rights are exercised, the way in which economic, social and cultural rights are defined, the framework of elections, political parties and movements and civil society organisations, and civic education. The second is authorisation, the way in which electoral processes, be they elections, be they referendums, take place, and the way in which bureaucrats and executive officials are subordinate to elected representatives. The third is the principle of representation, reflected through electoral systems, reflected through party systems, demonstrated through the empowerment of women and of marginalised communities. The fourth is accountability, the rule of law, the principle of certainty, of legally enforceable standards, of scrutiny and of audit. The fifth is transparency, achieved through open debate, through freedom of information and independence of the media. The sixth is responsiveness, systematic acceptance that consultation is a norm, that redress under the rule of law actually happens and is going to be effective, and that is supported by devolution and decentralisation of decision-making. And finally, a value of solidarity, acceptance of diversity, and maybe also an international dimension. Now, these values don't always totally reinforce each other. They are different in different cultures, and strength in reflecting one may be something that gives you some weakness in reflecting another. Take the question of designing an electoral system. You can do all sorts of things in designing electoral systems. You can emphasise popular representation, you can emphasise accountability of the government, you can emphasise accountability of individual elected members, stable government, political competition, effective opposition and oversight, sustainability, all sorts of things, all desirable, but you can't actually emphasise them all at once. And the process of designing an electoral system is about making political choices as to which are specifically important. Now, with that context and with the importance of citizens and organisations in assessing the way in which democracy and democracy building is developing, I'd like to turn to a few lessons about power dynamics in the context of democracy building and democratic transitions. The first one is that wide buy-in to change is essential, either because there are elites who have the muscle to derail the process, or because while people generally support the process, you find a reaction against anything perceived as victimisation. Dialogue and broad consensus helps build that support for new institutions and frameworks, maybe between the parties and other national stakeholders, as we saw through the Indonesian change between 1999 and 2003, maybe through wider constitutional commissions, as, for example, in the Philippines. If you don't have that broad enough consensus, the new framework that is worked on in so much detail may not be followed through, may fail to be implemented. Guatemala, 15 years ago, developed a new constitution. The old power structures then successfully campaigned to defeat it in the referendum to adopt it. Colombia got as far as getting its new constitution adopted in 1991, but then didn't actually implement any of the provisions within it. How far can you go in introducing change? Chile restored democracy after its referendum in 1988, but at the time built in some things that couldn't be done. The legislature can't increase the budget total that the executive proposes as an overall figure, although it can change very widely within it. And it protected General Pinochet's status, first as Commander-in-Chief and then as Senator for life. There is an inevitable tension between vagueness and high level of interpretation that you sometimes find in transitional provisions, and in the high level of and the need for rules to be clear so you don't get surprises that damage legitimacy later. Finally, the end result won't be perfect. There will be great expectations of new constitutions, even when there have been many of them. But nobody ever gets all of the detail right, and values change over time. There are perhaps two approaches that address this. One is the one that India takes, in which a very detailed constitution is easy to amend. There have been over 100 amendments since it was adopted over 60 years ago. The other is the Indonesian approach, where the constitution is still relatively short and is about principles, but it's difficult to amend that, although much easier to amend the laws which follow from it. The symbols in the constitution can be just as important as the substance. In talking about the change to the Indonesian constitution, over 80% of the text of the Indonesian constitution was amended during the period from 1999 onwards, but it was a process of amendment. It was not a process of tearing it up and starting again, and that ensured that while the new institutions are really very different from the old ones, the 1945 Constitution as a symbol, something that's part of the independence struggle, remains in place, and it's something that gives legitimacy as a label to the new arrangement. The whole Indonesian process very much gives a highlight to the importance of the words and the vocabulary generally, the way in which the discussion is founded in the unitary state, whatever then follows from it in defining the way the state works, the recognition that options described as federal or as parliamentary are ruled out by history. Dr. Surin said some very important things earlier this afternoon about decentralisation and devolution as a helpful tool in sharing power, in restricting winner-take-all, even in countries such as Indonesia, such as also the Philippines, which are not federal. They also provide an alternative route for political talent to rise. A decentralised system has led us to President Jokowi in Jakarta, who first became mayor of a city in central Java, then governor of Jakarta. Another decentralised system gives us Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India, who built his political career in Gujarat. Neither of these two is the product of a central party machine in Jakarta or in Delhi. I spent a fair amount of time between 1999 and 2001 working with the reformers within the Indonesian Regional Autonomy Ministry, and from the inside, the kind of things that I've heard in the debate now in Bangkok, the idea that is everybody ready, are there the human resources, is it a good idea to hand all these powers over to who knows who? These are exactly the same things, said in pretty well exactly the same words as people were saying when trying to implement decentralisation in Indonesia back 15 years ago. Decentralisation will, incidentally, mean that there are places that are not successful. The whole point of it is that giving power to a lot of different groups of people to do roughly the same thing means that you will get different outcomes. You will get authorities which are creative and imaginative. You'll get ones that are delivering services extremely competently and effectively. You'll get average ones that muddle through. You'll get people who make a mess and get in the papers and on television as a result. And you'll get people who are asleep and do nothing at all. That's actually intrinsic to the whole idea of decentralisation. You can't avoid it. It's actually showing that if democracy involves the power to make decisions, it includes some level of ability to make indifferent or bad decisions. It's the oversight, it's the communication, it's the comparison, it's the competition that improves the quality and the service delivery of decentralised government. Another important lesson from that decentralisation process is that Dr. Surin described one of the two decentralisation laws passed in 1999. There were in fact two. The one that defined the structures and a second one that talked about finance. If local authorities get powers on paper but can't exercise them because the funding's not available on a timely basis or indeed at all, disillusionment follows. The original Indonesian financial decentralisation law provided 25% of the state budget by law to local authorities, put in separate provisions about the division of land and property tax, and also in relation to natural resources revenue. If you look at the Omnibus Local Government Code of the Philippines, there are principles that are very similar in the way in which they're put together. Direct election of the head of government is sometimes debated as a power-sharing mechanism. In a parliamentary system, as Thailand has, there is only one global example of people doing this. Israel tried it between 1996 and 2001. They never successfully answered the question of what happens when a directly elected Prime Minister doesn't have a parliamentary majority and loses a vote of confidence in Parliament, a situation where you then have the Parliament saying, we will not let you form a government, we want somebody else to do it, and the Prime Minister saying, I have the backing of the people, I'm elected to do this. A question: do monarchy and democracy require parliamentarism? In both Indonesia and the Philippines, the head of government's also the head of state, because both are republics with presidential systems. But is it possible to make a full separation of powers framework work under a monarchy, with the monarch as head of state, with a directly elected head of government who is not responsible to Parliament on policy votes of confidence? Bicameralism, the way in which you think about two chambers of the legislature, is another key component of the overall institutional power sharing package. There are essentially three options for putting an upper house together: direct election, indirect election by bodies at a lower state or province level, and appointment. Or, of course, you can combine some of each. Where there are direct elections, the pattern around the world is almost always a different electoral system for the lower house and the upper house. Once you've decided you're going to have a second chamber, what are the powers it's going to acquire? If you have a presidential and congressional system, like the Philippines does, like a lot of Latin America does, you often have equal powers for both houses. So the directly elected president and executive are balanced by two powerful legislative houses, both of which have oversight functions. In parliamentary systems, it's more usual that the two houses have unequal powers, that the upper house cannot introduce money bills or is restricted in what it can do with budgets. Sometimes the lower house can override the upper house completely when there's a disagreement. Germany and Spain are examples. And sometimes the upper house powers are only a delaying power, which you will see in the UK and also in Malaysia. The new Indonesian upper house has a very limited and subsidiary role in legislation, but it does have, although it's not fully explored it yet, considerable potential as an oversight body. In thinking about the way in which two chambers work, there are many design options. Finally, a word about the relationship between democracy building and state building and good governance, which has been over many years a huge argument in the democracy community and in the development community. It's an argument which I think the scholars and the analysts are now coming close to finding an answer for. There is a global study published last year by Pippa Norris, which shows that democratic structures and principles which strengthen citizens' demands on the one hand, and measures to expand the capacity of the state to respond effectively, reinforce each other. Each on its own can be helpful, but it's not guaranteed to be so. If you have both, they reinforce each other. Democracy building and state building and bureaucratic governance development go together, and when you have both, the chance of building a stable, growing country significantly increases. State building also is shown to dampen issues of internal conflict. Democracy can also help this too, but it only does it if it's accompanied by an inclusion and a power-sharing framework. A democracy that has strong majoritarian tendencies does not have an effect that assists the resolution of internal conflict. To summarise, effective institutions are necessary but not enough. Well-organised, legitimate and credible elections are essential, but they're also not enough. Critical, involved and questioning citizens may sometimes make life awkward, but they are an important support to strengthen the balancing of power, and in strengthening the balance of power, strengthening sustainable democracy. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ellis. I just would like to emphasize on the 3 points presented by Dr. Ellis very briefly. I think you mentioned about the necessity of a kind of a homegrown democracy, which it certainly reinforces the fact that we should avoid the C and D, the copy and duplicated political institutions in Thailand. The second point that I think is quite interesting for us is when Dr. Ellis draw the parallel between Indonesia and Thailand, especially when it touch on the decentralization, which lead to the third point I would like to make, and I think is the most important point, and is very much lacking in our society, is the role of the citizen. ผมคิดว่าประเทศไทยเรานี่พูดถึงแต่ประชาชนมาตลอดให้ความสำคัญแก่ประชาชนแต่ไม่ได้ให้ความสำคัญเท่าเทียมการเป็นพลเมือง the role of the citizen. You know, we are always talking about civil society, ประชาสังคม but we rarely touch on what I would call it สังคมประชาการ or the civic society. I think Professor Harris has mentioned repeatedly the role of the citizen. You cannot have a sustainable democracy in the country if we don't have the สังคมประชาการ or the civic society, you know, the citizen of Thailand. มีแต่แค่ประชาชนคิดว่าคงไม่พอจะต้องเป็นพลเมืองของประชาชน and though the พลเมืองซึ่งจะต้องทำให้เกิดเรื่องของ good governance and the sustainability of our democratic regime. I think KPI has conduct a study on the role of the citizen participation. We even organized one annual congress on civic education. I think this is very much the weak point, perhaps the weakest point in our society. So I think it now depends on all of you who are really the leaders of the society to think about this and really disseminate those idea of เปลี่ยนประชาชนเป็นพลเมือง So let me move to our last panelist, Professor Alan Hicken, please.
Thank you. I am keenly aware that I am the one thing standing between you and going home. So I will do my best to...
No, not home. Dinner.
Dinner. Even worse. Even worse. ขอโทษนะครับผมพูดภาษาไทยแต่ไม่เก่งเลยไม่มั่นใจเลยผมจะพูดภาษาอังกฤษนะครับ I want to just recognize and thank KPI for inviting me to come and talk today. I work in Thai politics and work on Thailand and institutional design and elections and parties in Southeast Asia and Thailand and Philippines and Indonesia some. And I came to Thailand actually. I've been here for several months, and I'll be here for a bit longer on a Fulbright research fellowship at Thammasat And I initially came with a plan of being here during elections. That did not happen exactly as planned, but it's nonetheless been a very exciting time, an interesting time to be here. And I want to talk today about balanced institutional reform, and in talk in a general way about the opportunities, the pitfalls, and the trade-offs inherent in institutional reform, building on some of the things that my fellow panelists have talked about already. And then talk, if I have time, talk a little bit about 3 areas of reform that I've been reading and hearing a lot about being discussed right now: reform of the Prime Minister, reform of political parties, and tackling corruption. And building on Professor Ellis's theme of comparison, what is it we can learn from other countries' experiences in these areas? Now, given the political reform currently underway in Thailand, the theme of this year's KPI Congress is a timely one. Balance is what all good reformers seek. A balance between competing ideas and interests, a balance between pragmatism and optimism, a balance between the status quo and a desire to change, and a balance between an appreciation and respect for the past, as well as aspirations for the future. This is a huge task. It's a kind of task which ideally we would like to have lots of tools. This is what we'd like, right? We'd like a toolbox just bursting with tools and instruments that we can utilize to try and tackle the problems that we face. This is what we usually have to work with, right? This is our toolbox. Frankly, reformers don't have a lot of tools, or as many tools as we'd like. We cannot quickly reshape culture. We cannot undo the past. We cannot force opponents to see eye to eye as much as we might like to. We have no power to imbue all public officials with moral hearts and incorruptible souls. We cannot change human nature. The major tool that reformers can wield is institutional reform. Institutional reform, to be true and sure about this, is a clumsy and inefficient tool at times. It's often more like a rock than a scalpel. And yet we know that institutions and institutional reform can be a powerful tool. And that's because institutions help shape incentives of all kinds of political actors, of voters, of politicians, of bureaucrats. It helps determine whether they cooperate or compete with one another, whether they form lots or a few parties, whether they focus on policy or patronage, to whom they're accountable. It shapes whether voters vote for national or local parties. And it also helps determine the capabilities of those actors. Who has a seat at the table? Can they act unilaterally, or do they have to cooperate with others? Who is their power? What is their power relative to other actors in the system? And because it shapes incentives and capabilities, institutional reform also shapes behavior. And that's what we're usually after. But institutional reform itself is a balancing act. Institutional reform never takes place in a vacuum, and this is something Thailand knows well, all of you know well. As social scientists, we often like to think about life in terms of ceteris paribus, or all else being equal experiments, right? What happens if we keep everything the same and we change just one little thing? What would happen? And that's very useful for theory building. It's very useful for testing ideas and empirical analysis, but in reality, ceteris is never paribus. All else is never equal. Often reforms come as a package. Lots of things are done at once. Some of these are going to interact. They're going to reinforce each other. In some other cases, the goals of one set of institutional reforms may be undermined by reforms in other areas. And institutional reforms work best when they are carefully calibrated to work together as a package, and when they are in balance with other existing institutions. But to function properly, they also have to work with existing norms and with existing political cultures and attitudes. So the implication of all this is that institutional reform is a really difficult and really messy process. This is something that Thailand can certainly attest to, and my own country can certainly attest to. Reformers can predict certain things. We can have strong expectations about the effects of reforms, but there are always things that reformers do not anticipate, especially when we're doing large-scale reform. There are unexpected events. There are people behave in ways we didn't anticipate. There are interactions that we didn't fully expect. So there are always unintended consequences. Now, that said, institutions are still the best tool we have in our toolbox at least in the short to medium term. Now, as I mentioned, my interest in research and writing lies in the area of political institutions, especially elections, electoral systems, political parties in Southeast Asia and Thailand. And so I get this, in the last few months since I've been here, in fact, I landed in Thailand the day of the coup, I get this question a lot. What is the best blank for Thailand? And it might be, what's the best electoral system for Thailand? What's the best system of government for Thailand? What's the best form of democracy for Thailand? What's the best type of political party for Thailand? I'm never foolish enough to give a strong answer to that question. I'll say something like, well, I have ideas and thoughts, but this is something that for Thais to work out for themselves. This is an appropriate question for Thailand. And these are important questions, right? These are the big questions, right? But because this is such an important occasion today, I'm actually going to answer the question. I'm going to give you the answer. I'm going to tell you what the best electoral system is for Thailand. I'm going to give you the best government, the best form of democracy, the best kinds of parties. So you want to get your pens ready. What is the best system for Thailand? And here's my answer. It depends. It depends on what? Well, it depends on what the goals are. What do you want to accomplish, right? What is the problem that we're trying to fix? And this requires us to be specific about the kinds of changes that we want to see. Saying that we need to reform the political system or the political system is broken actually isn't very helpful. It's equivalent of me going to the doctor and telling him that I want him to make me better, right? I've got a problem. In order for the doctor to actually get to work, he's got to do a couple of things first. First, he has to diagnose the problem or the symptoms that I have. I'm feeling tired. I have a strange growth on my elbow, whatever it is, right? What is the symptom that I have? And then, once he has the symptoms, he has to pinpoint the cause or the problem. Why am I tired? He has to do some tests probably or ask some more questions. Maybe I have low blood sugar or I'm not sleeping enough, whatever. Reformers must do the same thing. They have to ask three crucial questions. And sometimes we forget to this. We jump right to the remedy. Here's how we're going to fix things without asking these three crucial questions. First of all, what specifically is the problem that you're trying to fix? Second, what do you think is the source or the cause of that problem? Now, we're going to disagree about those two things, right? People with good-hearted and smart people are going to disagree about exactly what the problem is and exactly what the cause of that problem is. But that's why we have these discussions and debates. And then third, how would the proposed reform cure or remedy that problem? You have to be able to answer that question. Specifically, how would this fix the issue that we're dealing with? And again, often in reform discussions, we have cures and remedies being thrown about, but without sufficient attention to these three basic questions. These are crucial if we're going to actually answer the question, what is the best system for Thailand? We have to answer these questions first. Now, coming back to the theme of balance, and building some on what the previous two speakers have talked about, institutions embody trade-offs. They reflect decisions, choices about which sets of goals and values are going to be prioritized over others. Capable reformers recognize those trade-offs and they try to strike a balance consistent with whatever goals and priorities they have. And let me just mention two of the most common trade-offs, and these are going to be familiar to all of you. This is review. Right? The first is the trade-off between what we might call majoritarian visions of democracy versus proportional visions of democracy. Majoritarian visions, or sometimes we might call them centripetal visions of democracy, places great value on decisiveness, on effectiveness, governments being able to act quickly and efficiently. It places great value on identifiability. We want voters to be able to vote directly on who they want to control the government. And it places great emphasis on accountability, being able to clearly assign credit or blame to policymakers and then hold them accountable. So we want clarity of responsibility. And that leads to preferences for small numbers of parties, ideally two parties or two blocks of parties, one of which will likely attain full control of the government, and then a minimal number of checks and balances on those chief executives to allow for decisive action. That's contrasted with the proportional vision. Sometimes you might call that a power-sharing vision or consensus vision. that values giving voice and representation to lots of groups, to lots of interests, to have lots of seats around the table. It values power sharing and consensus more than it does majority rule, and it values policy stability and credibility over decisiveness or quick action. And it values close connections between voter preferences and the policies that are adopted. So you want the legislature and the cabinet and eventually policies themselves to mirror society, to mirror voter preferences. And that leads to a preference for lots of political parties, large multi-party coalition governments, lots of checks on executive power. Now, there's a trade-off here. This is a continuum. You can't have everything at once, as Professor Ellis said. Moving in a proportional direction sacrifices some decisiveness and some clarity of responsibility. Moving in a majoritarian direction can come at the cost of better representation and policy stability. And either extreme can be problematic, as Thailand has certainly experienced. A second trade-off is between institutions that place high value on responding to local interests and those that emphasize responding to national interests. And we've talked about decentralization today. I won't mention that, but let me talk about a different part of this dimension. The local vision tends to privilege close ties between individual politicians and local voters, local constituents. So voters need someone that they can go to ask for help or they can interact with. And it focuses very much on responding to local needs, providing goods and services for local constituents, local constituencies. So it has a preference for weaker political parties, more decentralized political parties, and elections that are very candidate-centered and less party-centered. National vision privileges close ties between politicians and parties. We want politicians looking up more than they look down. We want them listening to and responding to party leaders and the packages of policies that the party label represents, and focused on national policies and responding to broad national constituencies more than local constituencies, or in addition to local constituencies. And so they have a preference, this vision, for strong, centralized political parties, party-centered elections, where voters primarily vote on the basis of parties, not on the basis of candidate characteristics. And again, there's a trade-off here, and either extreme can be problematic. And the kinds of institutions, the mix of institutions that we choose, place us in different places along this two-dimensional space. Where would we locate Thailand? Well, this is much of my work has been focused on, looking at where Thailand has been placed historically and how it's moved over time. Pre-1997 Thailand, the diagnosis of the reformers in 1997, as they sat around thinking about a new constitution, was that Thailand had lots and lots of political parties, right? Too many parties. 15 parties would stand for election, 12 might win seats, 4 to 6 would form the cabinet. And so we had these large multi-party coalition governments that were notoriously short-lived. I think the average was 18 months in the 80s and 1990s. Lots of gridlock, lots of necessary policy reforms being left undone. And that places Thailand pretty far to the extreme right on this figure. What about the second dimension? Well, the parties themselves, as you all know, pre-1997 were generally weak, non-cohesive, undisciplined, temporary alliances of convenience, right? These were not parties with strong party labels. Voters didn't care much about party labels. Politicians themselves didn't care about party labels. Some party leaders didn't care much about party labels. Party switching was rampant. Elections were highly personalized. Candidate was much more important than party for voters. And politicians were focused on providing goodies and services to very narrow constituencies with very little attention or interest even in broader public good, the broader national policy. So they weren't champions of the public good. They weren't shepherds of the national interest. They weren't even stationary bandits. As the saying goes, they were like ants on a sugar cube. Now, these two dimensions then place Thailand in this quadrant here, this lower quadrant. The extremes on both dimensions. This is kind of in pathology territory, right? This is a system that was not functioning very well by all accounts prior to the 1997 Constitution. And the reforms in the 1997 Constitution were designed in part to move Thailand closer towards the center, right? With fewer, larger parties and stronger parties. And I'm not going to talk in detail about exactly the reforms and exactly how they intended to do that. But in fact, that is what happened, right? Since 2001, we've seen a sharp reduction in the number of parties in Thailand. We have larger, more national parties. Since 2001, we've seen a sharp move towards more majoritarian government, with many of the governments headed by majority parties. In fact, as Dr. Surin talked about today, there's arguments that Thailand shot too far on that dimension. So, perhaps somewhere located here we could argue about exactly where to place Thailand. But it's certainly the case, KPI surveys and others certainly show that voters and politicians seem to care more about policy than they did in the past, and that voters are more motivated by party than they were in the past, although candidates and local ties continue to also be important. So the question is, if this is where we are now, where do we want to be, right? What new balance do we want to try and craft? Finally, let me just talk about 3 areas of reform that are getting a lot of discussion right now, and the CDC will be tackling these issues and discussing these issues in the days and weeks to come. And let me just talk about sort of ideas of playing around with a prime minister, playing around with parties, and combating corruption. Professor Ellis already talked about the idea of a directly elected prime minister, so I won't add anything there. But let me talk about the second proposed reform that's been floated recently, that the prime minister might be nominated and selected by the parliament, but that he or she would then not have power to dissolve the parliament, and the parliament would not have the power to dismiss the prime minister. So they'd have separate survival. Now, were Thailand to go down this road, it would be in pretty rare company. There's only a few other examples of this in the world, and both are presidential systems. Switzerland has a system that is sort of similar, and Bolivia occasionally uses a system when there's no one candidate that wins a majority of the presidential system or presidential election. Now, that kind of system should make the prime minister a bit more independent from the legislature, and parliament would make that a bit harder to control for the prime minister. So it moves us towards the less decisive end of that continuum. In a traditional parliamentary system, we need to think about what helps keep a prime minister honest, what helps keep a prime minister trying to do a good job. And there's typically 3 things that we've talked about that help constrain a prime minister. One is that he or she has to maintain the support of a majority of parliament in order to stay in power, right? They lose that support, they get thrown out of office. They also have to maintain the support of the majority of the parliamentarians in order to pass legislation. And then finally, ultimately, they and their party have to face voters again in an election. So those 2. Now, these things aren't always effective at constraining prime ministers. Again, we all can think of examples of that. But moving to a prime minister and a parliament with separate survival immediately severs that link, right? The prime minister is no longer dependent on the parliament, so the parliament's not really a constraint on the prime minister. And if it's been as has been proposed by several scholars and academics, if the prime minister is now limited to only a single term, so no election for the prime minister, then that link disappears as well. Now there are very few constraints on the prime minister. The only thing holding him or her in check is the need or desire to cooperate with the parliament to pass legislation. And if the prime minister can think of ways to work around parliament or to cobble together a majority with pork or patronage, then this constraint is pretty weak as well. Now, this might not be a problem if you have a good man or good woman as prime minister. And we all want good people, right? But to hold out hope for good people is often a quixotic quest. If reformers, when we think about reform, we hope for angels, but we design for devils, right? We, wang mi kon di, right? Wang waจะมีคนดีแต่ว่าเราคิดว่าสร้างสำหรับคนมันใช่ไหม? We think that we design for the person that we fear, not for the person that we hope. Now, another proposal that we've seen floated around is that the prime minister be a nonpartisan nonpartisan prime minister, not from a political party. Some proposals that I've seen would require that. Some would allow it as an option. Now, a nonpartisan prime minister is not all that common when we think about comparative perspectives, but it is rarely the norm. It usually arises out of a crisis. There's a stalemate among the political parties, and they can't agree on who the prime minister should be, so they pick an outsider. This happens in the Baltic states not infrequently. Or there's a severe political or economic crisis that makes an outsider attractive, often an outsider with economic experience for a short period of time. And we've seen that in Italy, for example, or Hungary, or just recently in Tunisia. Usually these are for a short period of time. And these are interim prime ministers that are in power for months or a year or 18 months at most. So having that as a long-term solution is pretty rare. What about parties? There's a lot of discussion right now about whether or not, what to do with independence, whether to allow for independent candidates, nonpartisan candidates or not. Let me say a little bit about this. There are sort of three options here, right? One is that we could not allow independence. We could require every candidate for office to belong to a political party, and that's been the norm for national elections in Thailand for a couple of decades. There is some information out there that Thailand is the only country where there's that requirement. That's not the case. Any proportional representation system by default requires candidates for office to be members of political parties. Indonesia, Cambodia both have these requirements by default, and Singapore, also in ASEAN, has similar restrictions in effect. Tanzania, South Africa, Mexico, El Salvador, there's lots of countries that have used similar kinds of restrictions and requirements. It's becoming rarer, though. Many courts recently around the world have found that bans on independent candidates violate restrictions, violate freedoms and voter choice, and so have reversed or overturned laws banning independence. So the norm around the world really is that independents are allowed alongside partisan candidates. And the hurdles to those independent candidates running will vary from election to, from system to system. But as a result, we have a lot of independent candidates who run for election and who actually win seats in a lot of countries. And so political scientists have studied independent candidates a lot. And we actually know some things. So there's a few stylized facts that we've learned. So one is that independents actually often aren't that independent. These are often not outsiders or new fresh faces. These are often failed partisan candidates. These are candidates who couldn't win for a party or got kicked out of a party, and so they run as an independent candidate. And often when they're in the legislature, they align with political parties, even if they're nominally independent. There's a hope that independent candidates will somehow be better, that nonpartisan candidates will be higher quality, will be a better character. And we've, again, political scientists have tried to study this and measure this, and what they found is that independent candidates aren't generally any measurably better or superior MPs or candidates than partisan candidates. And then finally, there is some arguments and some empirical work that supports this, that independent candidates, especially when there's a lot of independent candidates, tends to be associated with higher instance and higher degree of money politics. And that's because in order to win an election as an independent candidate, you have to make up for the support that you don't normally get from a party. That's both financial support and also the support you'd get from voters. And there's a couple of ways to do that, right? You might be able to do it if you right? If you're famous, if you have a famous face or a movie star or something, you can get voters to vote for you if they know you. Or if you have money, that may be a way to fill the gap. But your election is entirely based, if you're an independent, on your own efforts, your own personal reputation, and your own personal connections with your constituents. There's no party achievements, no party policies to rely on. You have to build and you have to fund a personal network of support. Okay, and finally, there's also an argument that maybe we shouldn't have any parties, that we should have all candidates be independent. And this, again, is really rare. We only, at the national level, we really only see that in a couple of instances. We see it in microstates like Tuvalu and Palau, where their legislatures are so small and the countries are so small that you don't need parties. You see it in non-democracies like the Gulf states, where the legislature is just an advisory body and parties are outlawed. But you do see it at local levels of elections quite frequently around the world in democracies, where local contests are not partisan. And from this last group, we've actually learned quite a bit about what happens when you have nonpartisan elections, and there's arguments for why you'd want to do this. But there are some things to be aware of. So what we find out is when we ban parties from elections, elections often are still partisan. Everybody sort of knows which side of the divide each candidate is on, and those elections still have a partisan character. And we certainly see that in, for example, elections in the Senate in Thailand. It's still sometimes very often easy to see which camp candidates fall in. We also find that when there are nonpartisan elections, voters vote less frequently. They are less motivated. And that those elections are less likely to be contested, and when they are contested, they tend to be less competitive on average, and that they tend to provide advantages to incumbents. Incumbents have, because there's no party to rely on, you need your personal reputation again, and incumbents have name recognition that challengers often do not. Okay, finally, just a couple of words on combating corruption. There's a common concern, this is a common concern around the world. How do we deal with corruption? What should an anti-corruption reformer keep in mind as he or she ponders institutional reform? Well, one is there's just no magic bullet, right? There is no institutional panacea, but there are some strong patterns that emerge, and there's two that I just want to mention. One is that where we have clarity of responsibility, where voters have the ability to monitor officials and detect those responsible for unsatisfactory outcomes, corruption tends to be lower. And when they have an opportunity to hold the people who they blame for problems or for corruption accountable by throwing them out of office, by voting them out of office, we tend to see lower corruption. So that implies free and competitive elections, tends to be associated in almost all studies with lower levels of corruption. A strong press becomes very important. So not only do we need to have watchdogs and independent agencies, we need to have the information be brought to the public's attention so they can then hold those guilty of corruption accountable. Political parties, we need one-party states tend to be very corrupt, and multi-party states with lots of parties tend to have higher levels of corruption. In between seems to be the happy medium. And government stability also seems to be associated with lower levels of corruption. When governments are highly unstable and there's lots of turnover, politicians have shorter time horizons, and they get what they can before they get kicked out of power. So there's a lot for reformers to consider, a lot to try and balance, and hopefully these few thoughts have helped set the stage for what I'm sure will be some interesting discussions and debates over the next couple of days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Higgins. Very briefly, I think I would like to point out three areas that you touch on. You see, well, first of all, I hope you stay long enough to observe the next election.
Me too.
Yeah. Aren't we on? Aren't we all? Well, I think you talk about the structural reform, definitely, and take into account culture, norm, and institutions. And you ask a very pertinent question: what is the best for Thailand? I don't know whether any one of us here can answer that, but you're kind enough to give different options. You see the dilemma of the two trade-off, but at the end, it's really up to us to answer this question: what's it best for Thailand? But you are also provided additional guidance on the two areas, which may lead to the sustainability of democracy in Thailand, and that may be the answer we need. The three areas of the Prime Minister, political parties, and the most important, in my view, is combating the corruptions. This is a major issue. I come from the private sector, and I can tell that this is a real major issue in the private sector, and we're working on that. Well, I think we come to the end of these presentations by the three distinguished panelists. I can say that, there's one common theme among the three is that they all can provide us a bag full of Lego pieces, but it's up to us to use those pieces to build a house. So I think with that, please join me to thank our three panelists, and then if you are not too hungry, perhaps we can allow 2 or 3 questions. Questions, please. I think comments you can make it tomorrow morning session and in the group discussion in the afternoon tomorrow. But right now, I would like that we took the opportunity of our 3 distinguished panelists to ask questions. You mean to ask more the Lego pieces. So please. Yes, please. Can you bring the yes. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, I am Sombat. I teach English, my private company. I am very impressed for Dr. Hicken. You give the solution, the problem and the cause and the solution of the political system in Thailand. So my question is, what is the best to solve the political problem in Thailand in general? Please.
It depends. that really is, up to ties, right? There are trade-offs, and we'll talk in the next couple of days about what those trade-offs are and what you sacrifice if you move one direction and what you gain if you move one direction. There is no magic formula for Thailand. There is no one system. As a general rule, think that democracy functions best when there are good parties. So that's one thing to think about. But the recipe for good democracy and good governance in Thailand is one that will be unique to Thais, and not that will be not will be something that I imagine, but something that you come up with.
Oh, okay. And what do you see in the future of political system in Thailand from now?
It depends. That Thailand has a great opportunity, right? And I am a great enthusiast and believer in the ability of Thais to wade through difficult times. There's no question that Thailand has some difficult challenges ahead of it. I think that the principles of sort of mutual respect and mutual tolerance are key as we move forward. And I'm optimistic that Thailand can find a way to bring all interests to the table and feel that everyone has a part in this wonderful democracy.
Oh, lastly, I thank you. You made a lot of homework about political in Thailand. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions, please? Yes, please.
My name is Khanna. I'm student of Lampheng University. From Dr. Surin said, the Thailand more developed and the gap between people is more greater. And the last speaker, I forgot the last speaker, what's the name? He said the opportunity to impose accountability. And the question is, now Thailand is in the situation is not normal. So my question is not normal. So the question is, the point of the meeting, the seminar is, I think is the wrong one. We need the balance of opportunity more than the power. What do you think? Thank you. So,
Well, I would like to answer that.
Can you repeat it? I picked up half of it.
เดี๋ยวขอพูดภาษาไทยก็ได้ฮะเดี๋ยวผมจะ
because I'm trying to train myself to use English too. Because we have the people have not the poor people have less opportunity to develop.
Okay.
So we have to balance the opportunity.
Okay.
So and the more the rich
โอเค
people
ได้แล้ว
have
ฮะครับเข้าใจแล้วฮะครับ he's talking about the income disparity and the opportunities to more the opportunity how you go about giving equal opportunity
ขอถ้างั้นเพื่อจะได้ทำที่ขอทำภาษาไทยก็ได้ครับ เพื่อว่าคืออำนาจเนี่ยเราไม่ต้องการหมายถึงว่ามันไม่ใช่ประเด็นที่ว่าเราจะกระจายอำนาจไปให้ทั่วประเทศไทยแต่เราต้องการคือกระจายความเจริญเพราะตั้งแต่สมัยรัชกาลที่4ที่5คือที่เรารอดพ้นมาเป็นเอกราชมาได้จนถึงทุกวันนี้ก็เพราะเราต้องการพัฒนาประเทศให้เจริญทัดเทียมนานาอารยประเทศโดยที่จนถึงรัชกาลที่5เขาก็ท่านพัฒนาโดยเริ่มจากส่วนกลางก่อนไม่ว่าจะเป็นไฟฟ้าประปาไปรษณีย์แต่แล้วทุกอย่างก็ขยายไปทั่วประเทศแต่ว่ามีหลายอย่างที่มันยังไม่กระจายอย่างเช่นการศึกษามีมากมายที่มันไม่กระจายถ้าความเจริญกระจายไปแล้วเนี่ยภายในความเจริญนั้นเนี่ยมันก็จะมีอำนาจอยู่ด้วย
ผมเข้าใจแล้วครับ
อีกนิดเดียวครับแต่ถ้าอำนาจจะกระจายไปแล้วเนี่ยมันก็ไม่แน่ใจว่าจะมีความเจริญหรือเปล่าครับผม
เข้าใจแล้วฮะครับ No he talking about decentralization of development
As I indicated at the end of the presentation, the cause of development is helped if both democracy building and state building effective bureaucracies are going on together, and that therefore an effective constitution and an effective government is going to be concentrating in both of those fields. There are also two specific points that I'd like to make in the implementation of decentralisation. One is that because different parts of any country are more rich or more poor, any effective financial framework for decentralisation not only involves a guarantee that local authorities will get enough money at a time when they can use it, it also requires some kind of national equalisation so that you don't end up with rich regions keeping all of their money and doing things within them, and poor regions having no money and not being able to do anything. That equalisation formula is an essential part of an effective framework for decentralisation. The other thing which it's worth keeping an eye on in introducing decentralisation, something else that we watched people in Indonesian ministries trying to do 15 years ago, when you decentralise and want to encourage development and service delivery, there is a role for minimum standards, a role that says you can all do this in different local ways, but you must achieve at least this standard, and that's a sensible tool. What you have to watch in implementing it is the bureaucrats who are taking 10% off the national contract under the existing corrupt regime, writing the minimum standards so that they end up taking the same 10% off all of the local contracts instead, because their friends are the only people who can meet the minimum standards. The implementation of minimum standards is important, but has to be done in a way that means that there is real local option for the best service delivery to address income inequalities, and it doesn't just entrench what was there before.
ก็คงหมายถึงว่าจะให้ความกระจายความเจริญนี่มันก็ขึ้นอยู่เรื่องของการกระจายอำนาจด้วยนะฮะแล้วก็ในระดับประเทศนี่ก็คงจะต้องเป็นมีนโยบายที่จะเป็นให้เป็นเรื่องของ equalization นะฮะเชิญคำถามต่อฮะครับ
ขอโอกาสถามอีกข้อหนึ่งได้ไหมครับ opportunity to ask the constitutional is not is not the answer because in UK has no constitutional but people understand in Japan has full understand people have full understand in democracy that mean but in Thailand the most people in Thailand had not understand the meaning of democracy. They just only go to election. It's called democracy 3 minutes. หมายความว่าความเข้าใจของประชาชนเนี่ยเป็นสิ่งที่สำคัญที่สุดที่เราควรจะมีมากกว่ารัฐธรรมนูญถ้าเรามีรัฐธรรมนูญที่ดีที่สุดในโลกแต่ประชาชนยังไม่เข้าใจประชาธิปไตยมันก็ต้องร่างรัฐธรรมนูญอีกเรื่อยๆครับขอบพระคุณครับ
ครับอันนี้ผมขอตอบเองเลยฮะก็ตรงนี้ครับที่ผมพูดแล้วว่ามันจะต้องเกี่ยวกับเรื่องทำประชาชนให้เป็นพลเมืองต้องมีความเข้าใจเรื่องประชาธิปไตยมีความเข้าใจถึงสิทธิและหน้าที่ด้วยนะครับไม่ใช่สิทธิอย่างเดียวครับเชิญเลยครับถ้าเผื่อไม่มีอะไรผมหวังว่าคือเราก็ยังไม่ได้จบเฉพาะวันนี้นะครับเรายังจะมีการประชุมพรุ่งนี้เต็มวันซึ่งหลายท่านอย่างท่านเมื่อกี้เนี่ยผมคิดว่าคงอยากจะให้ช่วยเข้าไปร่วมในการประชุมภาคบ่ายไปแสดงข้อคิดเห็นซึ่งอันนี้ทางสถาบันพระปกเกล้าก็จะได้รวบรวมแล้วก็นำมาเสนอในวันเสาร์เช้าอีกทีหนึ่งนะครับอันนี้ต้องขอบพระคุณทุกท่านนะครับที่ให้ความสนใจอยู่จนทั้งถึง5:40เลยเวลาไปนิดเดียวนะครับผมขอความร่วมมือจากท่านทุกท่านขอบคุณแพนลิสต์ของเราทั้ง3ท่านอีกครั้งหนึ่งครับขอบคุณมากครับ